Hi, in this video I'm going to start a short series of videos talking about how to model the macroeconomic situation using aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And I have macroeconomics here with kind of a question mark on it because I am a microeconomist, and most of my videos are and will always be on microeconomics or econometrics or spatial topics. But right now I'm teaching a macroeconomics class, so I'm going to throw in a couple of macro videos here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you an introduction to the idea of an aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, and I'm going to do it Berkey style. Which means you have to realize, I don't want to get any emails from people saying, but what you say isn't what my textbook says. You're doing it a different way. And one reason I'm doing it a different way is I think my way is a little more simple and makes more sense. But another reason I'm doing it a different way than your textbook is because every textbook does this differently. Macroeconomics is a science, in quotes, that is not complete. There is not agreement about how the macroeconomy works or about how different changes in the economy will affect the macroeconomy. It's too complicated. We don't have enough data to have a concrete picture, and a lot of times nobody really understands what's going on. That's one reason why I prefer microeconomics, because it's a little more solid and a little more concrete. But that doesn't mean that we don't know some definite things about macroeconomics and how they work. So I'm going to do this and explain this model in a slightly different way than your textbook probably does. And I'm going to talk about it in a slightly different way than I've ever seen it done before. But it's the same material and you get the same kind of intuition. I'm not trying to say anything radical. I'm just depicting the model in a slightly different way than what you'll probably see. But again, everybody does this differently. And I want to start here. Before I go on any further, let me mention that this handout, along with these notes that I have down here about the things that can shift the curves, I'm going to make this available on my website at www.berkeyacademy.com. Click on Files, and I will call this handout, let's see, I'll save it as something like ADAS .pdf or something like that. So aggregate demand, aggregate supply .pdf, so that you can find this. Or maybe I'll call it macro adas.pdf. Okay, sorry, let's get started with the actual material here. First thing we have to do before we can talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we have to review for just a minute what a regular non-aggregated demand and supply curve look like, basically. So let me just draw a very ugly, simple X and Y axis here, and on a normal demand and supply graph we have the price of a single product here, and we have the quantity of a single product, maybe peanut butter or potato chips or hamburgers or something like that. And we have a demand curve that slopes downward. And what this demand curve tells us is for each price of hamburgers that we might see, perhaps $10, there's a different quantity that people will want to buy, maybe 2. And at a lower price, people will want to buy a higher quantity, so maybe 5 at a price of $5 or €5 or whatever. So there's a negative relationship between price and the quantity people will buy. But then also things can shift the demand curve. Even if the price were 10, we might see on a different day that people want to buy now. At a price of 10, people want to buy 5 hamburgers. And at a price of 5, people want to buy, I don't know, 9 hamburgers. Well, if we observe these red points, it must mean that something fundamental has changed about the price and quantity relationship. So let's talk about what some of those things. So here's a new demand curve. I'll call it D2. Something has to change except the price and the quantity to shift the curve. And so things we typically think about that could shift a demand curve are people's income. It could be the price of a related good. or other things. So for example, if this is hamburgers, we might want to buy more hamburgers if the price of hot dogs goes up, for example. Um, Now, when we start to talk about a macroeconomic model, instead of the demand for hamburgers, we're talking about aggregate demand. So we're talking about the demand for everything. So let me label this with an aggregate, AD now. So what's got to change in this demand curve if we're talking about not the demand for hamburgers, but the demand for all goods and services in an economy? The same stuff we're talking about when we talk about GDP. Well, what has to change is instead of quantity here of hamburgers, now what we're really talking about is real output or real GDP. So we have to change how we label the axes. Instead of the price here, we're talking about the price level. Or we could think about this as being the CPI, the Consumer Price Index in a country. The higher the Consumer Price Index, the higher the price level. So we're not talking about $10 here unless we're thinking about this as an average price per unit. But I think it doesn't make sense to talk about it that way. I would rather talk about a CPI of 100 down here and maybe 200 up here. A higher price level where on average the price of all goods is higher. And so you have to know how we calculate the CPI. It's basically the average price of goods and services consumed by a particular kind of person. So kind of on average. So we change the axes here. We also have to change the kinds of things we're thinking about that could shift a demand curve. So over here we were talking about for the demand for hamburgers or hot dogs, we think about income or the price of a related good changing that. Now, some of these things don't make any sense. There is no such thing as a price of a different good or a related good if you're talking about all goods here, right? So that's not going to make sense anymore. And it also kind of doesn't make sense to talk about income. Why? Well, because normally we think about this identity between GDP in a given year is the amount spent by everyone in an economy, and usually we think about that as being equal to income, because all the money spent has to be equal in the large sense to all the money earned. So we can't talk about income, but we can talk about wealth. As people in an economy get wealthier, then they will be able to buy more by spending out of their wealth, not necessarily spending based on their income. So we have to not talk about income, but we can talk about wealth. But basically what we're talking about when we talk about shifting an aggregate demand curve, let me add an A here, we're talking about things that will change the willingness and ability of people to buy more stuff, more real GDP at each price level. So we're talking about things that will increase C plus I plus G plus net exports. So real GDP equals consumption plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. Anything that increases the amount purchased by these people at every price level, we're going to be talking about an increase in the aggregate demand curve here. Now let's first talk about why the aggregate demand curve, why we're so sure that would have a negative slope to begin with. So let me erase this stuff about the demand curve shifting real quickly. And let's focus on this idea. Why is it with an aggregate demand curve we think that there would be this decrease as the price level goes up or down? So let's look at these 2 points here. So this point, say real GDP would be 2 trillion measured in a base year. Adjusting for inflation is what we're saying here, at a price level of 200, but it would be 5 trillion at a lower consumer price level of uh, consumer price index of, say, 100. Why do we expect that that could happen? Well, we talk about three main reasons here when we go into that. So let me page down here to some notes that I will also have here on this handout. Let's see, down here. So these are just some notes about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we need an aggregate model. A single product model doesn't really explain everything. We're combining all individual goods into one price level and into one quantity level. I basically went through all that. Aggregate demand, as I described, it's a table which we can graph as a line that shows the various amounts of real GDP which domestic and foreign buyers will desire to purchase at each possible price level. So we've already talked about a couple of these things, how the substitution effect doesn't really make sense. The income effect doesn't really make sense. So the substitution effect is the idea that when we're just talking about one good for hamburgers, as the price goes up, we buy less because we can substitute something that's now relatively cheaper, hot dogs. But when you're talking about all goods, that doesn't make sense. The income effect doesn't make sense either, because with hot dogs, you're talking about, or hamburgers, say, when the price of hamburgers go up, it makes you feel poorer. But in the aggregate case, since income now varies with aggregate output, GDP, it doesn't really make sense to talk about that. So what determines this slope? So that's the little section right here that I was heading for. One reason is what we call the wealth or the real balances effect. When the price level falls, purchasing power of existing financial assets, think about the money in your pocket or the amount of money that you have in a bank account, rises. At lower price levels, you can really afford to buy more things with it. So the real balances effect is one reason that explains why real GDP or more real GDP is demanded at lower price levels, less real GDP is demanded at higher price levels, ceteris paribus. The interest rate effect is the second reason why we can imagine that as the price level changes, the amount that of real GDP people want to buy will go up or down. And the interest rate effect says that a decline in the price level normally means lower interest rates also, because interest rates are related to inflation. So as price levels are decreasing, interest rates will also be falling, and that could increase spending on things like cars and also houses and also factories. And then the third factor here is that foreign purchases effect, which says all else equal, ceteris paribus, when prices here in this country fall, foreigners will want to buy more of our cheaper goods. Also, Americans will favor domestic goods over foreign goods. So if we're talking about the U.S. economy, as our price level falls, both Americans and foreign purchasers will prefer to buy American. So these are the three reasons that we use to justify this negative slope for an aggregate demand curve. Now let's go down and talk about what kinds of things could cause this aggregate demand curve to shift right or left. So basically, the way I think about it is anything that could cause the desired purchases by consumers, investors, government spending, or net exports other than prices. So what are some things we could think about? What could change consumer spending? Wealth, consumer expectations of the future. If you expect hard times ahead, you might start to save up. If you think you're going to lose your job, maybe you're going to save now instead of spend. So that will decrease consumer spending. Consumer indebtedness. As you weigh yourself down with a higher debt load, that means that you have less additional ability to borrow and spend. So kind of the opposite of wealth is indebtedness. You can think about it that way. And also taxes. If we tax consumers more, they have less money to spend on GDP, and so that's going to decrease consumption spending. And the opposite's also true. Cut taxes, people will spend more. What about investment spending? Well, interest rates, in fact, affect investment spending. Houses are in investment spending, but also mostly business spending is what we're thinking about here. Profit expectations by businesses, business taxes for the same reason as we were talking about with customers. Also technology. If a better available technology comes available, then businesses will want to invest in that new technology, and they will spend more to buy that better technology that will lower their costs. And also the amount of excess capacity already in the economy. So if you have factories already sitting idle, you're not going to be likely to invest in a new factory. G, changes in government spending. It just depends on what governments want to do. We can leave it at that, determined by the Congress and the President in the U.S. And net exports. So why would people abroad want to buy more goods in our country? Whatever our country means. I am in the U.S., so that's what I'm thinking about. Well, as people in other countries get wealthier, they'll want to buy more U.S. goods. Also, exchange rates are important. If the dollar is relatively more expensive, then people will buy less of our goods. If it's relatively cheaper, then they'll want to buy more United States goods. So when we think about, let's go back up and look at that aggregate demand curve real quickly. This is kind of a list of things you want to think about having in front of you when you want to decide, is there something going on in the economy that could increase aggregate demand right now? All right, now let's talk about aggregate supply. And the way I'm going to explain aggregate supply is kind of a combination of the way some people do it out there, but also I'm going to go off on my own a little bit. Let me erase this aggregate demand curve here real quickly to clean this up. So when I talk about aggregate supply curve, I'm going to draw it with three regions here. I'm going to draw it with a flat region. Let me change colors here so this is a little more visible. A flat region, which basically says that we can produce more goods, we can supply more goods in this region without increasing the price level at all. And so this region is at a relatively low levels of GDP. It's also where we have relatively high levels of unemployment. So that's what I want you to think about here, is very high unemployment. And by unemployment, we mean unemployed factories and people, all the resources necessary, labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. Lots of people sitting idle, factories sitting idle. It's easy to bring those people back to work and those machines back to work without pushing the price level up. But then there's a second region here where we start to have a positive slope. And this positive slope says that at some point you can keep increasing GDP, but in order to increase GDP, as labor markets start to get a little tighter and as factories start to get a little closer to full capacity, you can continue to increase GDP, but only by increasing the price level. So here we're talking about moderate levels of unemployment, maybe not quite full employment or the natural rate of unemployment yet, but we're getting close. And then there's a third region over here where we could add, where the aggregate supply curve turns sharply upwards and becomes basically straight up and down in this third region. And so this is the region where we're at full employment and we just can't produce anymore. If we continue trying to get the economy going faster, we've met, so we're on our, this is our full level of production, our full employment GDP level right here. We're hitting that boundary. We can't go beyond it. And if you keep trying to speed the economy up, you're not going to produce more GDP. You're only going to succeed in raising prices. And so in this region, it's red. This is usually the region where people start talking about the economy is overheating. So we are either in or trying to get beyond full employment level of GDP. So actually, when I think about this model, I tend to put the full employment level of GDP a little bit, let me put a little pink dot here, like somewhere around in this neighborhood. There's two ways you can think about this model, and let me give you both ways to think about it, because I'll describe this in both ways. You can either think about the full employment level of GDP just being slightly below this wall that you hit where you can't produce any more. And this full employment GDP, if we draw it a little bit below the absolutely straight up and down portion here of the aggregate supply curve, what you're saying is that it is temporarily possible to produce a little bit more than this pink level of GDP, if that's our full employment level, but we can't sustain that for very long. So this is one way to think about it. This is actually a little bit beyond full. So we could say this is a little bit beyond the full level of employment GDP. Suppose in the U.S., people usually think about the natural rate of unemployment. The best we can do in the long run is about 6% in the U.S. The Federal Reserve has said somewhere in the neighborhood of 6.3% or so, but somewhere between 5 and 7, depending on who you ask. If we get below that level of unemployment, it's only going to be temporary, and we're going to bounce back to a higher level of unemployment. If we get below 5, certainly to 4, we can't sustain that very long, and it's going to cause inflation, and eventually the unemployment rate will snap back. So if we get up into this level over here, we're eventually going to have to slide back down. That's one way to think about it. Let me give you another way to think about this, and this is kind of the analogy that I like to think about and prefer just a little bit. We could instead think about this as being this red vertical line here being actually the full level of GDP, but you can think about it this way. There's kind of a rubber band here. This isn't a hard wall. There's a pink rubber band around it. And so what that means, what I'm trying to say by the rubber band effect here, rubber band, the rubber band effect means that we can temporarily get a little bit beyond here, but then we're going to snap back. So let me give you an example. Suppose we are right here, and let me draw an aggregate demand curve. Let me just show you how this works. Very simple. I'm not trying to make this very complicated. Suppose here's our aggregate demand. Well, clearly we're going to have high unemployment rates here. So what should we do? Well, we should do something to increase aggregate demand. How can we do that? Well, let's go back to our list very quickly so that we can look and see what could we do. Let's just page down here. So we'll go back to that other page in just a second. So what are these things again that we were talking about? So how could we increase consumer spending? Well, we could, let me get a highlighter here. We could try to make consumers wealthier. Good luck with that. We could make consumers expect the future is going to be brighter. Maybe. Presidents try to do this. They give motivating speeches and say everything's going to be fine, don't worry about it. We could try to help consumers get out of debt somehow. I don't know how we do that, but here's the real policy thing that might work. Try to lower taxes. And so this is a fiscal policy measure. By cutting taxes, consumers will have more money, and then maybe people will have more money to spend. Or we could try to get businesses spending more. Well, we could try to lower interest rates. We could try to make businesses think the future is bright. We could cut business taxes. We could try to help invent better technology. Or, not quite sure there's a policy measure for the amount of excess capacity. Or, the government could just spend more money, and that could increase aggregate demand, certainly. Or we could try to negotiate and help foreigners buy our goods somehow. We could try to help other countries, our neighbors, develop and become wealthier. And as their incomes get higher, then they will buy more of our goods and trade with us. We could also manipulate our exchange rates, and some countries do this to try to export more. China has been accused of manipulating their exchange rates to make their currency artificially low, so people buy more things from China. And so if you want to do any of these things, you can use either fiscal policy, and fiscal policy can increase aggregate demand by cutting taxes or increasing spending. So let's draw another one over here. Higher aggregate demand. Or monetary policy. The Federal Reserve could create more money, which lowers interest rates, which gets businesses and consumers to borrow more money, which might get the economy going. So doing these things is going to increase the aggregate demand. Now, you see that we haven't had any bad effects from doing this. We've only had good effects, at least in the short run. The aggregate demand goes up. GDP will go up. Here's the equilibrium GDP before, maybe 4 trillion. Here's after, maybe 6 trillion. And we haven't increased prices at all. Hey, the best of all possible worlds. Now, the only long-term effects here are going to be that if the government increases spending or cuts taxes to increase this aggregate demand, call this aggregate demand 2, then they're going to have to pay that money back at some point. And so the government's going to increase their debt level by doing this. This is the cost, so nothing comes for free. Now, if the Fed does this by lowering interest rates and increasing, getting people to borrow more to get the economy going, again, these people and businesses are going to have to pay that money back at some point. So that's not really free either, but it's a way to get the aggregate demand increased. Now, again, there's the Lucas critique of this. If the Lucas critique says, let me just write this down here, the Lucas critique. I'm getting into things I didn't plan on, but that's okay. The Lucas critique says that people are smart, and if the government tries to increase aggregate demand by borrowing money, consumers are smart enough and businesses are smart enough to know that later on they're going to have to pay for this somehow, and their taxes are going to go up. So that consumers will respond if the government spends more to try to shift aggregate demand. Consumers and businesses will respond by cutting their spending to save for the future when they know that the government's going to come after them to get that money back. And so the Lucas critique says consumers and businesses will fight against the government naturally, not on purpose, but just naturally when the government tries to increase aggregate demand in this way. Some people don't like monetary policy because they say that it will increase inflation regardless. Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. In the current recession, we haven't really seen much inflation in the U.S., and here I'm talking about in the year 2013 so far. Now, let's suppose that you keep trying to increase aggregate demand. So we get to this point. Suppose we want to increase aggregate demand a little bit. Prices aren't going up at all, but suppose we want GDP to grow some. Well, we can do that. No problem. But we have to realize what's going to happen. Let me draw a purple line here. If we shift aggregate demand again, we can get higher GDP. Great. But we have to accept a little bit of inflation to get the higher GDP. And so I think this is why, if you want to at least talk about it in simplistic terms, and I do, this is why most Federal Reserves or central banks in countries say, well, we're going to allow some inflation. A little bit of inflation is fine. 2%, 3%, 4% is fine, because maybe by having a little bit of price increase here, we can get a lot of GDP increase. And wouldn't that be nice? And so maybe we're willing to live with a little inflation to get a little more GDP. And that's what's happening in this green region of the aggregate supply curve. Now, the problem comes if the government continues to spend too much, increasing aggregate demand even further, or the Federal Reserve and the central bank continues to create too much money, pushing interest rates too low for too long, then you're going to have the problem where here, let me draw a kind of in brown here, increase aggregate demand even further. What's going to happen? Well, let me use the rubber band analogy to try to show you what might happen. When the aggregate demand goes up even further and gets into this red region, usually what we see is that this rubber band stretches out a little bit, like this. So we might end up at a point like this. Let me call this point A, right here. At point A, we have gone beyond our full capacity GDP temporarily. Now, temporarily, how could we do this? Well, we have pushed unemployment down below the full employment level. If the full employment level is 6%, we're down at 3% here. We've pushed GDP up very high. We've also seen a little bit of price increase here to get to point A. And temporarily things can look like they're going well. You say, look, we've had a lot more GDP for just a little bit more inflation here. We've gotten a lot more GDP. The point is that this has to be temporary by definition, because when we say full employment level of GDP and we say natural rate of unemployment, we mean that in the long run we can't produce more than that amount of GDP, maybe 10 here, and we're at 11. We can't sustain that in the long run, and due to our population and the way we look for jobs, our natural rate of unemployment is not 3, it's 6. And so you can stretch this rubber band out here temporarily and produce 11 GDP, but what's going to happen sooner or later is the rubber band is going to snap back. So let me draw what happens when that rubber band snaps back. We're going to head in this direction. All of a sudden, you're going to see GDP drop and you're going to see prices shoot upward. And the reason I'm saying this happens is this is the kind of result that we see happen a lot with shifts in the Phillips curve. Watch my video on shifts in the Phillips curve, and I'll add a link to that right here if you want to see more about this. So what we'll see is the government is pushing economic growth, pushing economic growth, pushing economic growth, and we see unemployment go down, 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 down. We see prices go up a little bit, and then all of a sudden, boom, we see this snap of the rubber band, and prices go up, and GDP goes down. And that puts us on a different Phillips curve level, which also tends to more or less permanently, semi-permanently increase inflation. And so this is the real danger of trying to push into this region. It looks good in the short term. Politicians love doing this because they love to say, look, we're spending money and GDP is going up and the economy's great. But at some point, you have to pay the piper, and it's going to come back to bite you. And this little rubber band snap here is the way I think about that happening. So I'm going to end this video here. I'll come back and talk about some other specifics, but this is a really good way to think about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And if you understand this model, you'll understand what's going on basically in economies whenever you see these different shifts. Just the last thing I'll say is this can also work in reverse. If you want to avoid this rubber band snap, if you want to avoid this, then what you have to do is when you see that the unemployment rate is getting below 6%, immediately what should happen is the federal government needs to cut back on spending. The Federal Reserve needs to start cutting back on printing money and start raising interest rates. And if they do that quickly enough, we can avoid that rubber band snap, and we can just settle in to a nice kind of safe level of GDP here. You know, maybe somewhere between 9, 9.5, 10, something like that. But when you try to creep too close to 10 and try to push the economy too much and you start to overheat, this is what you risk. Your unemployment rate will go up anyway, and you're going to suffer inflation at the same time. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below and let me know what you think about this way to talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply.